I thought actually the place to begin is with your piece in Indianapolis. We actually have that it went up last month?
Yeah, last month.
You have to say it loud. So people
Last month.
Okay.
The story is simple and short. They asked me to come to Indianapolis, and I had never been to the museum there. And it's on some beautiful grounds that are maintained and cared for. Incredible opportunity to do something outdoors. And then they said, no, you have to go indoors. And I said, oh, please let me go outdoors. Because the indoors was this incredibly ugly space that was the dog of the museum, which they wanted to tear down, but we're going to take one last shot at doing something with it. And it was called the Grand Hall, and it was the center of the museum. When I looked at it, I was, as everyone else, deeply depressed. And then on my way home, I got a sense of an idea that something that might work, and it worked out pretty good, I think. They seem to be pleased. So that's the most recent thing I've done, and it's, I think, reasonably illustrative of the way I work now, which is dealing and beginning with a set of conditions. I don't really have a studio, and I don't try and plan things or in front or ahead of time. I find a place, I find a space, I run my hands over it, and sometimes I get lucky and come up with something interesting to do. Like with this one of the fun things is I really don't know if they're going to work. It's sort of like rolling the dice. On a couple of occasions, they don't, which when you have to tell a museum director on the last day that it didn't work, there's no show. You have to have a good sense of humor about that. And every now and then one of them actually thrills me. I mean, I get to see it for the first time the way everybody else does. And it does things that I had not anticipated. And in this case, a world of shadows. I mean, it's the lights, but actually the shadows are quite magical in it and are more complex than anything I assumed was going to happen. Also, it's very kinetic. People going through the escalators, and when you walk across it, because of the different wall being on two walls, it tends to do this moire for you.
My computer turned off, and I'm now turning it on again. You keep talking.
Oh, okay.
Turn this off up there while I'm getting it started.
I wanted to just set the tenor of the time a little bit. Ren told me something last night which I found to be absolutely terrific. On the internet, there's this, it says, a black man gets the worst job in the world to clean up after the fat cat white folks mess.
At terrible pay.
At terrible pay. And so to me, and then he prefaced that with, or he followed that with saying that walking down Michigan Avenue after the thing at Bryant Park was one of the more euphoric moments of his life.
It absolutely was.
It was sensational.
What was it like from San Diego?
Well, I actually, believe it or not, stood in front of the TV with my wife and my 14-year-old daughter, and we cried. Getting sentimental in my old age here.
Coming back,
Coming back to reality.
No. So what does that have to do with what you were just doing in Indianapolis?
What was that?
What does that have to do? What does that moment have to do with
The moment you
Indianapolis?
had on Michigan Boulevard?
Yeah, no, just the moment, our moment right now, in terms of the ambitions that you're thinking in terms of work.
How does one answer a question of that scale? You know, I think maybe there was a man named Pronofsky who did a series of lectures on PBS years ago, and I remember him saying at the end of it, the last thing he said was, the one idea which has retarded civilization more than any other idea is like father, like son, which was for me very startling. And I realized that actually the whole idea of living in the present, but actually working on who we are and where we're going, is the thing that thrills me the most. And so that's kind of, this moment has a sense of the future to me. I don't
Well,
know
okay,
how to answer it any better than that.
well, let me,
How did that go, or good?
okay. I want to go back now and talk about how we first got started, which is 30 years ago. We were having our conversations. It happened just very quickly that I was working with the oral history program at UCLA, and there'd been a interview that somebody else had done of Bob, and I was editing that interview, and I sent him a note asking whether he had ever read Merleau-Ponty's The Primacy of Perception. I was a philosophy major in college. And I have a feeling if I'd sent that note to you 2 or 3 years earlier, you would have just thought I was a hopeless wuss and of no interest whatsoever. Right? Okay. It happened that you were kind of interested in reading at that point. And the result was that he was at the office the next day, and we basically spent, to my memory, the next 3 years having lunch together. That you planted yourself basically under a tree at the North Campus Library at UCLA, and I'd come over and we'd talk. And one of the things, and I know you, well, I'll just say it, one of the things that you talked about that helped put things and helped me understand the swath of the last 500 years was you talked about the change in the subject of art. Do you want to try and remember what that was about?
Well, first I'd worked in Los Angeles for a good period of time, and had kind of cut my teeth on abstract expressionism, having a couple of heroes at the time. I think probably de Kooning being the most central one, but I had not really ever seen the work, except one time. They finally had a show in LA where the work had come, and I'd had a kind of revelatory moment in which I was walking through where the dinosaurs were. It was in a natural history museum at the time. Walked through the dinosaurs, and across, at about 50 feet away, I saw a very large James Brooks and a small Philip Guston side by side. And
I gotta find.
the
We
James,
can turn it back on right now.
it was the first live abstract expressionist paintings I had ever seen. And
So here was the James Brooks.
that wasn't the one, no.
Or it was a James Brooks like that.
The James Brooks was about 20 feet by 12 feet, and the Philip Guston was about this big. The James Brooks was strong color contrast of dark and light, black and white, red and green. It was a powerful painting by all measurable, anything you could measure. But the marvel for me, standing 50 feet away, was this little Philip Guston, which was a kind of scrumbly little painting, pink and kind of funny little greens and that. And this little Philip Guston completely blew the James Brooks right off the wall. And I'm like, wow, how is that possible? I mean, how can this small, very modest thing be that much stronger, that much more powerful? And so I thought, well, I'm going to have to pursue this a little bit further here. So I went to New York with the idea that I was going to have a conversation with my heroes or the people I knew. Went to, what was the name of the place? I forget the name of the restaurant. It was a bar that everybody hung out. Went to that bar, began to sort of start a conversation with some of the better New York artists, and they just kicked my ass. It was not a conversation, it was a kind of confrontation in which they immediately laid out a position for me beautifully. Bam, there it was. And I'm like, you know, unresolved, untelling, and I was blown away. I was blown away by how articulate and how concise their position in the world was put forward. So I went back to California and realized that I was deeply unprepared for that, and not even sure that I wanted to be involved in, but at the same time thinking, you know, if you have to deal with these issues, I think that in a way it's time for me to educate myself a bit. And the only way to do that was I decided not to read the sort of secondary and sundry things, but to deal with the primary arguments in the world, which was the basic philosophic giants that we know of. And so I started trying to teach myself philosophy, as he said, sitting under a tree. I would write down everything that Hegel said, as I read the phenomenology, and then I would argue with him. I'd write him down in red, and then I'd write me down in green, and then 3 pages later I'd have to apologize for, for my
That was typical of our conversations in those days at lunch.
Well, he would say to me, I'd say to him, bang, 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 he'd say, you better read that chapter again.
No, what I'd say, we were at Kierkegaard at one point, and you were just going down on, stop it, stop it, stop it. And I said, Bob, turn the page.
But so it was quite fun to have him. He became my tutor. And then at one point I said to him, what in the world are you doing in this job? I mean, this is just a Mickey Mouse little job. You're way over talented, way too talented for this job. And he said, like he ever said, I don't know. And I said, you know, it's time for you to get out of here. And I said, if you had your absolute druthers, anything you wanted to do, what would you do? And he said, he's a 60s radical. He said, I would write for New Yorker magazine. I said, New Yorker magazine? I never read New Yorker magazine. I said, what? Well, what? You know, why? And he said, because they're the only publication that publishes in depth. I mean, at that time, articles in full length. And it was a great forum. Plus, there was this little guy, what was his name? Shawn.
William Shawn.
William
Little
Shawn.
guy, William Shawn.
He was a giant, though, actually, an incredible, had so many articles that he could have published the magazine for several years. He loved writers and he loved writing.
We're coming back to you.
Okay, I'll be there in a minute. Anyway, yeah, I said, well, you know, why not? And he said, it's impossible because they don't take on new writers. So we had this conversation, this dialogue went on, and I'll make it brief. At one point, he got a small grant to do
a biography.
A biography of Warshaw, Howard Warshaw, complete loser. And Ed Keynotes, who's a complete joker.
And you, who was a complete what?
I wasn't involved in the
You were involved.
No,
you were the third. You were the third.
Anyway, Keynotes took him out on a boat, on a rowboat on the lake, and threatened to throw him off the boat if he ever, I don't know, did anything or didn't do anything. So he came back to me and said, I can't get this thing done. I've got to get it done. Can we do it together? I said, yeah, sure. So I took him around to my old haunts and my dance places and in the cars and that. And he wrote this book, which was published in the New Yorker. It was the first thing he had published like that. And from that point on, the next 10 years, he wrote more articles for the New Yorker than any other writer in the whole country.
Coming back to you, and in that article.
Well, I think that's a great beginning.
Okay, fine.
And the fact that the thing got published, you know, it was a complete surprise. It was never intended. There was no chance for it.
Okay. But in that book, one of the things that I think makes that book something that the rockers want to read and so forth is that you are incredibly articulate, seems to me, at describing at each of several stages what's going on and why you were an abstract expressionist and what was involved in that. For example, talk about Augustine and so forth, and then the different phases you went through. But one of the things that was very helpful to me at that time was this thing you did about the 500 years. So do it.
It's not that good. I said to him simply, you know, first of all, the history of modern art is a radical history. Most of our histories are homogeneous. That is, our most basic concepts or beliefs stay in place, and on the basis of their permanence, or seeming permanence, we can build these incredible hierarchies of thought and ideas, which we call civilization. And that one of the really crucial issues in a radical history is the idea that one has to confront their own beliefs and their own ideas about what the nature of the world is and what the reason for being an artist or whatever. And very briefly, I said, you start out with the King of Kings, the blood of the King of the Kings on the cross as a great meaningful subject, and the idea of art being transcendent, which is a beautiful idea, transcending our death, transcending our impermanence in the world, the idea that we live beyond ourselves. It's a marvelous ambition. But rather quickly, you have no longer that as the subject, but you have the king in his red robe. And then finally you have the Burgermeister in his red jacket. And the next thing you know, you have a commoner in a red coat sitting on the grass with a woman who is naked. You find yourself a step later with a red cloth and a couple of red apples, and you find yourself finally with the phenomena red. If that isn't a revolution or an incredible history, I'll put in with you. So the issue became very simply, why in the world would we take something so beautifully put together and so meaningful, take it all the way apart? It's not an accident, it's not incidental. Too many generations, too many people have acted in this thing for it to be incidental. So you have to take it serious. Why would we do that? And what would be the role, what would be the subject of art at the end of that kind of history of 200 years now?
And you were talking about
so
how
that's
when you
what I
get to
said.
Cubism,
When I got to Cubism.
well, that you get to the marriage of figure and ground. And
Well, if you take the idea of the marriage of figure and ground just as a moment in this, having already, in a sense, broken down all the hierarchy of subject matter, the whole idea of abstractly referencing things. It's very interesting that the word abstract is essentially turned around backwards, just to give you how radical that history is. The word abstract means to be derived from, in its fundamental sense, because there's now second and third generation use of the word. The word abstract means to be derived from or related to, always indicating a duality, this in relationship to this. So when you think about so-called pictorial art is actually abstract. When one looks at the picture of the King of Kings, one references the meaning of the King of Kings. And the veracity of the art and the success of it is how well it illustrates, or in a sense, denote that idea, that concept, that meaning, that subject in the world. And so therefore you have this constant duality. When you find abstract expressions, when they were confronted with this thing, what does it mean? I.e., what does it mean by not looking at it, but by referencing it in the world? You were forced to, at this moment, by the abstract expressionists saying, it is. Who are you? What are you? In a way. And what they had done really is turn that world all the way upside down, in which one didn't reference a way, but it became a relationship between you and the actual phenomena that you're involved in. So I think it's interesting that the word abstract then becomes applied to it. And the only reason I can think of is that we had become, and we are still, so addicted to, and by the way, this is not over with, it will always continue. Painting is not dead, never will die. But the whole idea of referencing is one way of knowing in the world, and it's one kind of understanding. And what you're confronted with is that the world is not one-dimensional in that way. There's another way of going, and there's another way of knowing. And so what you have, in a sense, is two truths or two realities existing simultaneously. That's the fundamental import of modern
by the way, I
art.
was going to just show an example of your abstract work at one point.
This was in my shit period.
Will I say anything more about it?
But yeah, it's full of piss and vinegar, full of like that, meaning nothing. One of the things in looking at those paintings is that I had a friend named Craig Kaufman, and while I was painting these paintings, full of gesture and getting in my Zen mood to do it, and all that sort of thing in my young youth, I shared a studio with Craig Kaufman. We sort of had one room, and he sat over there and painted on this wall. I stood over here, painted on this wall. And while I'm doing this thing with all my pots and paint and that, he would get up and he'd put a little teeny pink of red and a little thing of green and a little thing of purple, like that, on this medical table that he had. And then he'd go across, and he had a smock on, and he would sit there, and he pulled his nose all the time. He'd say, man. And then he'd get up and he'd walk across and he'd go, like that. Make a little mark, and he'd go back, and I'm like, what? It was quite an experience. And one of the things that was most telling was that he was a hell of a lot better artist than I was. So I started paying a little more attention to the kind of relationship that he had with the work, the kind of time involved and what have you, and stopped being all gesture, and found, in a sense, that since my paintings were so full of nothing in a way, also so out of control, I had to give myself a lesson in discipline, and which was that I had, for a while, to control this thing so that everything in there I at least intended. And so I took on this format of these very small little paintings. And what I found out at the end of those, having done them, is that they were mannered and superficial, which meant that I was mannered and superficial. And so I go ahead if you want to go. We're walk down memory lane here. What am I doing
That's
here?
one of the pickup sticks.
Yeah, so anyway, the problem with the paintings was that they were always Rorschachable. In other words, you could psychoanalyze them, or you could Rorschach them. It's a cow jumping over the moon. And you see now docents going through museums, especially with kids. Now, what do you see in that painting there, you know? And they say, I don't know. And then she'll say, can't you see that there's a zither zipping through this? And they say, oh yeah, there's a zither zipping through there, you know? So they begin corrupting them immediately from the idea of the possibility, you know, which is the opposite, because they come with no baggage and sometimes can really get into the painting much more quickly than you and I, carrying all our stuff around. So I tried to paint a painting that, in a sense in which the mark was not Rorschachable. And I took the very simple assumption that a straight line or a line really was the least complex sign as such. And I was trying to avoid the whole idea of signs, metaphors, what have you. So I painted those paintings, which
And then you went from that to this, where you're still kind
Well, what's happening is that I'm finding out, like with the Philip Guston, that I could get much more activity with two lines that were not, you know, like this, but were in a sense in a relationship in which real tension took place. When you do it like that, and you say, well, there's tension, but you're also, it's like seeing the magician's hand. You're aware of why. So I tried in a way, the means became less and less. Go, keep going. That's too. Where are we now? Yeah, we're straight lines. Okay, 4 straight lines on a painting. 2 blue, say, and 2 pale gray or something like that. For me, the paintings were becoming much more powerful. By all measurable things, they were not. But they were still, in a sense, formal paintings, to make this quick. Formal paintings in the sense that there was still a composition, and there was still a sense of space. Certain lines came forward, other ones were retreated in that. So they were still conventional paintings in a way. Go on. Let's get this over with. And these are like, finally, I painted with just 2 lines on the painting.
You could hardly see this. Is a terrible photograph, but you could see the 2 lines.
Going back to the thing he said earlier about the gentleman who introduced us, not photographing them. But one of the things that was interesting is that these paintings became basically unphotographable. And the reason is that the camera really essentially, which is not a critique against camera and photography, but they definitely, it is a system of signs. They deal with signs, metaphors, and what have you. And there is certain degrees of tactility and a sense of physicality and what have you, but very minimal. They really are, it's really in a sense a tool made up from the pictorial reality and the concept of dealing with pictures and what have you. So finally sort of painted a painting in which there was, didn't photograph. So I was only really just trying to make a point that that was one of the facets of this way of going.
What you used to say was that a photograph could capture everything that the picture was not about and nothing that it was about, that it captured the image and not the presence, basically.
Why don't you go ahead and go on from here? You're doing better than I'm doing.
No, we're continuing. But I do want you to describe what was going on. By the way, again, one way to think about this is he's trying to get people to stop thinking of these as photographs of cows jumping over the moon or even of photographs of pickup sticks, and get you, I don't mean photographs, I mean paintings, and get you to the point where you're just, it's not of anything, it's just a presence, that you're in front of it, and he gets to this point here. Now you were doing two lines of the canvas,
2 straight lines, and basically I've gotten rid of all imagery whatsoever as much as possible.
And what was your work like? What was it like when you were painting these things? And how long did this go on?
Well, it took a couple of years to paint, well, about 10 of them.
So you did 2 lines, 10
essentially painted, I would, at that time I was in a learning process, so I would get the line on, and then my question became, well, how did I put the line? I mean, i.e., did I put it on very smart or with some sense of design or sense of a relationship? And I would look at the line and I would go to sleep. And then I'd wake up and go to sleep. My concentration wasn't that good yet. And they were mesmerizing in a sense. And so I had this sort of, again, this give and take learning process. Excuse me.
And you did
Prompt.
7 days a week? How many hours a day?
Yeah, I worked every day from like 7 in the morning till like midnight. Had a beer at midnight with my friends at Barney's. And anyway, it took, I did 20 lines in 2 years, working every day. But what I learned a great deal, obviously. The whole process shifted itself in the sense that I did not put the lines on in any kind of an intellectual way or a smart way or a more interesting way. Basically, I found that every painting, at every ground, every situation had its own kind of presence about it. And I'm nothing mystical here, because I'm about as mystic as a fullback at Ohio State. At some point, there became a place where the line was in the right place if I spent long enough to find it. Let's go from there.
So now, just one thing I would say about going to when you
eliminated the mark. Let's get going.
Okay, I just want to say that one thing is when you're at these paintings, if you're standing in front of them, you can't see both lines at the same time.
Good point. Yeah, your eye becomes mesmerized and becomes a different kind of scene. No, it's good. The other four compositionalists have said these are not. You become suspended, in which you're actually not looking at anything per se. Okay.
Okay, then what?
So the question is, how do I paint a painting without a mark?
Because
the mark is the
people
last
kept on saying,
residual.
"Oh, those are the paintings of the two lines." No, that's not the point.
People
so
said
what's this?
that.
So then I see that I'm going to get a close-up of what this is.
So I tried to paint a painting that didn't have a line or a mark on it. The first thing I did was to spend about a year building stretcher bars, very slightly convex, very slightly curved, but very, very gently, enough so that the surface became charged, but at the same time, you didn't attend the making of it as such. I tried a lot of different things. Finally put these red dots on, bright red dots on very carefully, in the sense that if I put them on too uniform, they became a pattern. If I put them on too raku, they became, in a sense, spots on it. So I had to put them on extremely carefully. And then I put an optically perfect green dot between every one of them so that the green and the red canceled each other out. And what you saw, if you stood there for a period of time, was a field of energy. I mean, it became like actually just like a ball of energy in the space.
When you go to museums, people typically come up to one of these pages and say, "Oh, there's nothing there," and they walk away. But if you stand there, and I've watched this happen, if you stand there for a minute, suddenly the painting blushes, and you blush right back at it. People literally blush looking at these paintings. It's like so strange with that kind of energy. And we went from that, and we're going to go real fast now because I want to get to the current stuff. So let's, from there you go to...
But anyway, no, there's something that happens at that moment. For the first time, I saw the shadow around the painting, because for a moment, it's before it begins to happen, I see the shadow. I see, first of all, the idea that the whole thing's within a frame, which to me is an amazing, highly stylized learned logic, that everything, the whole dialogue, everything we're interested in having to do with aesthetics can all be put within a frame. That mystified me. My eye no longer, in a sense, could stay within that frame. I thought all of a sudden that, like, perceiving in the world is not that way at all. When I look around at the world, there's no frames. That's not how we see the world at all. That's something we've learned, a whole process that we've learned. Brilliant. I mean, brilliant idea, but at the same time, not fundamental. It's not really how the world presents itself at all. It depends, not only is it all, not within a frame, it happens in all dimensions, and it happens phenomenologically. That is, it's in motion all the time. That's the reality of the world we live in. Now, if I want to attend that, if I want to really make that a piece and part of my art, I find myself with a lot of limitations that have to be broken. I also saw the shadow for the first time, and the key to the shadow for me was that here's something that quantitatively doesn't have any reality. That is, I can't weigh it, I can't measure it. If I were to move the light, the shadow would disappear. So in the quantitative realm, it has no import. on the other hand, perceptually, it is extremely critical. We couldn't walk or move through the world without shadows. They're a piece and a part of the whole process of actually organizing the world for ourselves. So the whole idea of being a painter, I had a really interesting dialogue, very brief. These paintings were absolutely finished all the way around the edges. They came to a point on the edge. Frank Stella said to me, "Why in the world do you do that? I mean, you've got a real anal problem there." You know? I said, he was doing the octagon paintings at the time with an opening in the middle, right in the center of it. And I said, "Well, why don't you?" There was the canvas at that time, just sort of pulled around the edge and just left tack there. And he said, "Because it's not important." I mean, that's a revealing statement. It's not important. To me, suddenly, everything I saw was important. There was no such thing as figure and ground, the ground being, in a sense, secondary. Everything was a figure. Everything, in a sense, was a piece and a part of how I processed the world. It raised hell with my whole idea, so I had to essentially
start incorporating.
I had to paint a painting that didn't begin and end at the edge, if that was possible.
And so from there we go to, well, let me show what it looks like first when you come upon it at the museum. Or
That's cool. No, just stop right there.
Okay.
I made them round to start off with because it lacked the critical corners. I didn't realize that people would
Here's another one
interpret them
that's
as
just like
mandalas,
Yeah, look at
and would find yourself. I started being thought of as being very spiritual, which I'm not.
Should I show what this looks? Should I show that? To show what it
No,
does?
we're good, like where we are. So I've essentially painted a painting that didn't begin and end at the edge, which essentially put me in the middle of nowhere, since the only thing I knew how to do was be a painter. I tried to figure out where I would go from there. I made a three-dimensional object as a kind of, for a moment I thought that if I go to 3 dimensions, in other words, be a sculptor, that would solve the problem. But the same rhyme and reason for why the sculpture becomes a focal point in the world, the man on a statue.
This one here, that's the Northridge.
That's a column. I made one of these plastic columns. They're like 2 tons and 32 feet high. And as you can see, it's fairly transient. Anyway, I essentially had put myself in the middle of nowhere. The question then was, do I somehow continue to modify this? It seemed like not a really interesting idea or an interesting quest. But this raised a lot of questions, and what I really became was much more interested in the quality of questions than, in a sense, the process of having answers.
One thing, just before we move on, is that he had gone effectively. One of the things that happened, if you bury the figure in ground, if you take that seriously, you can't very well have the ground of a painting, the figure of a painting against the ground of a wall. You have to take on the whole wall. And eventually you can't very well have the figure of a privileged space in a studio or a gallery in the middle of the ground of the world. You end up out in the world. And this is, it was completely misinterpreted by some critics, Kramer and people like that, as a negation of art, as an act of despair. On the contrary, it wasn't that you were saying that it was pointless to be an artist or something, but rather in a way, it was what would it be like to engage the entire world the way that, with the kind of energy, the kind of presence, the kind of focus that we ordinarily just apply to artworks. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that's grand. You have to take into consideration, like I say, the beauty of questions is essentially that once a question is properly posited, the answer becomes in some way inevitable over a period of time. It may not happen in your lifetime. The 200 years of art, as I understand it, up to this point, has been a kind of, as I did earlier, a break from the past. It has established itself without going into a new philosophic ground. It's already done a new conceptual ground. Mondrian did that beautifully when he took a subject like a tree and started it in a beautiful drawing, and finally it ended up like in a plus-minus series of just marks. He essentially dismantled that whole kind of thinking in a way. So the whole, and the abstract expressionists provided a whole new visual language. So in a sense, my generation, if I take that seriously, if I take this idea of the marriage and figure around seriously, then the painting obviously exists as a figure, and the world around it becomes the ground. And what it really is a meaning structure. Most meaningful things to the least meaningful things. You have Christ on the cross, and you have all the spear carriers in the painting, and so on and so forth. So this idea of a hierarchical structure is not something that I did, but this history is more critically a flattening of that hierarchical structure. And we become confronted with the question, what would a non-hierarchical structure look like, and how would it work? I mean, we essentially process information, good, bad, right, wrong, up, down, left, right, all that, hierarchically. And it works, and it will always work, but it's not the only way to organize. Essentially, at some time, we can talk about what a non-hierarchical structure looks like, but it's one of the questions that I inherited from the abstract expressionists.
And what's interesting here is that you got to a point, just so you know, we have about 10 minutes to go, so we'll...
That's right.
Yeah, doesn't time fly when you're having fun? But we had, you got to a point where you literally said, at one point your contribution to the Venice Biennale was to put some string, a square of string around
well, that's true, but the story is much more entertaining.
I'll tell that story. That's a great story.
I was asked to be in a small show at the University of Massachusetts, and it was a painting show, and the guy asked me to come, and I did an installation in the staircase, very ephemeral, almost not there, not bad. That year they decided to not spend a lot of money on the Venice Biennale, and they were going to just export the show and put it in their whole. I don't know if you've ever seen the pavilion. It's a very small little pavilion. But the director, Hugh Davies, who's still a very close friend, was enthusiastic about what I did, and he really wanted me to come to Venice. And we're going to turn the world around. So we went off to Venice together, and I looked at this little pavilion, and I came up with some kind of an idea, which was probably pretty crazy. And he said, "Oh, I love it." But he was not in charge exactly. There was somebody in Washington D.C. which he had to pass everything through. So he called the guy in Washington D.C. and the guy said, "No, you can't do that. It completely gets in the way of everything." And he said, so I hung up. He came to me. He said, "It gets in the way of everything. You got to come up with a better idea." So I thought about it, and I did something up in the rafters, out of the way altogether, completely. And so he called up the guy in Washington, D.C. He said, "He's in the rafters. He's doing it." And the guy said, "It's still too intrusive. See if he'll look outdoors." Bang. So he comes to me and says, "Oh, I got to tell you, he wants you to look outdoors." So I went outdoors. I'm sitting on a bench, and I was looking, not knowing what to do exactly. And
Israeli artist.
yeah, Israeli artist came over from he had his critic with him. They travel as teams in Europe, and they sat down next to me and said, "What are you doing?" I said, I'm kind of out here trying to figure out what to do." And he said, "Oh God, I've been here for 6 months. I have $1 million. He had $1 million to do his thing at the Venice Biennale. It's a big deal. So he kind of wanders off, and I'm sitting there, and Hugh comes out to me and he says, "I hate to tell you this, but I just called the guy in Washington, D.C., and he said, we're out of money." I thought, oh shit, now what, So I'm sitting there, and there's 4 trees, and their leaves are falling. This is in the fall, and the leaves are falling on this beautiful little space in between. I thought, I like it. It feels good. So I go to the hardware store, I buy 4 big nails, and some string, and I come back and I make a frame for this thing. I take the oldest idea of focusing in the world, and I put you in this position of having to deal with this thing that's just happening during the day. Of course, in that milieu, nobody ever is going to have that chance to see that sort of sitting out there in a corner. But about 3 or 4 years, and I never heard a word from it, which, by the way, it happens to me all the time. I do something in New York, and I'll come home, and I don't hear a single word. And I think after a while, God, I'm not even sure if I did. I begin to get a little dazed, woo, did I even do that? So but living in my happiness out there, I don't worry about it. And which is one of the things, I had a happy childhood. Pisses a lot of people off in the art world. And work out of the idea of joy and wonder as opposed to. But I'm back, and I get asked to come to St. Louis to audition, I guess, to do a project there, which really would have been a terrific project. There were 4 artists we all brought there, so I had to go in first. I went in, I made my pitch, and had my 2-tone shoes on, and did my dance. And then on the way out, I'm talking to the next artist who's coming in, and I hear a guy in the back say, "Well, I don't give a damn. That son of a bitch will just take our money and he'll just put it on a piece of string and he'll take it and run." Needless to say, I didn't get the project, but by God, somebody had seen it.
From that moment where you were content to just do that string, you have, at first, you've gone down to what we call point zero, right? That you have been content to walk around the world and experience it vividly.
I don't know how content I would have been, but I certainly looked like that's what I was going to do. I better get used to it. I just kind of become a pretty good painter, and suddenly I had to leave the studio, and I had no idea where I was going to go or what I was going to do. I wandered actually mostly around the Four Corners area, the desert area, because it has that quality to it, in which there is very little in terms of things and stuff, but a lot of presence. And so it was a good place to sort of play games in my head for a while. It took 2 or 3 years to finally begin to figure out what I might do next. But
and you were basically available in response, as you said. You would come and talk to people, but you'd also do pieces that were site-specific, but even more site-conditioned.
Yeah. I did a lot of pieces in a lot of funny places in the middle of nowhere, none of which have been recorded and none of which exist, and no one ever bought one. It became actually somewhat of a comic opera. I remember I did a thing at the Whitney one time, and you've all been to the Whitney, I'm sure. And it was on the 4th floor. I did the entire 4th floor, and it really had to do with the degradation of shadow from one end of the room to the other. But the thing that was great about it was this huge elevator, which you have to wait about 10 minutes to get on this elevator to go, and you go up to the floor, and the thing opens. Well, you don't want to miss that elevator, so the door would open, and they'd go back in the elevator. I've never forgotten that rocking step. They'd step out, step back in again.
The other thing that was hilarious about that opening at the Whitney was it was a huge, he had taken a piece of scrim over a period of thing as wide as this, much wider actually, hanging from the ceiling down to about 6 feet with a...
Eye level.
What was it?
Eye level.
Eye level, black strip across, and the only light was the light coming in. Okay, log out. Okay, I said okay. Turn this off.
And a black band around the room.
But the point is that it was the only light lighting this thing up, and it changed all during the day, was the window in the corner, way in the corner, and it was incredible. You stood there, and it did quite amazing things.
But the reverse of it also is that when you're doing what I'm doing, sometimes you think, am I doing anything? What am I doing? But I thought an interesting illustration of, in fact, its impact is that they said to me, Mr. Irwin, they called me Mr. Irwin. Mr. Irwin, you have to understand that we open our exhibitions and have done traditionally now on Tuesday night. I said, oh, that's interesting. There's not going to be any light in there. You won't be able to see anything. Oh, yes, you're right. So we had this sort of dance for about 6 or 7 days, and we went through the whole thing. And they opened it on Tuesday night.
And the great thing was at the opening,
Think about
as it opened, people were with their champagne glasses, and it was still kind of gloaming twilight, and it was getting darker and darker, and people acted as if nothing was happening. They continued to have their conversations, and it was presently...
It tells you everything you need to know about museum openings, doesn't it?
And at a certain point, we would be huddled there, standing in the pitch black,
We huddled.
desperately waiting for the elevator to arrive and open and splash light, and then it would close and we'd be back in the dark again. But anyway, and just with just a few minutes.
Well, the long and the short of that is that it didn't fit. Obviously, it implies that the whole system, the whole structure is, in a sense, not completely adequate to underwrite our actual processes of what we're doing. What's happened in modern art is we put ourselves in a position in which this is not intended as an onslaught. It was never a nihilism or never a rejection of traditional forms. It's just simply saying that the world is more complex than that, and things exist on more than one level. There's more than one kind of truth. Once you have more than one kind of truth, you can't build a hierarchy. So in a sense, the whole idea of the museum structure, the whole idea of the art world structure as it exists right now, is to underwrite a particular kind of art. It essentially formed itself around a concept. When the concept changes, it means and ultimately implies that all the systems around it have to change. So the implication of modern art, not me, but modern art is a grand idea.
Big ideas.
Big idea. Excuse me.
So that probably is a good place to stop.
Yeah.
So thank you.